She was fired from the ranch for saving a horse. But what happened the next morning made everyone question everything they thought they knew about loyalty. The rain hammered the stable's wooden roof like bullets, each drop echoing in the darkness. Clara pressed her back against the barn wall, her heart pounding as she watched the foreman, Hayes, pace back and forth, his boots splashing in the muddy puddles. His face was a mask of rage, veins bulging on his thick neck. "You disobeyed a direct order," Hayes snarled, jabbing a finger toward her chest. "I told you to leave that horse. He's worthless. Lame leg, bad bloodline. Not worth the feed we'd waste on him." Clara's hands trembled, but not from fear. Anger burned in her chest as she thought of the young stallion lying in the stall behind her, his leg wrapped in makeshift bandages she had torn from her own shirt. She had found him during the storm, pinned beneath a fallen branch, his eyes wild with pain and terror. While Hayes ordered the men to leave the animal to die, Clara had stayed behind. "That horse can heal," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Give him time, and he'll run again." Hayes laughed, a cruel sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Time, feed, medicine. You think Morrison pays us to run a charity for injured animals?" He moved closer, his breath stinking of whiskey. "You've been trouble since the day you got here, girl. Always thinking you know better than men who've been working cattle since before you were born." The other ranch hands lingered in the shadows, watching the confrontation unfold. Not one of them would meet her eye. Clara had worked alongside these men for 3 years, breaking horses others deemed unrideable, mending injuries others called incurable. But now, as Hayes raised his voice, they all looked away. "Pack your things," Hayes continued, his voice rising. "You're finished here tonight. I want you off Morrison's land before sunrise." Clara felt her world crumble. This ranch wasn't just her job. It was her home. The small room above the stable, the horses she had trained from foals, the land she rode across every morning at dawn. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, destroyed because she couldn't watch an innocent animal suffer. "The storm's not over," she said, a note of desperation in her voice. "At least let me wait until morning." "No!" Hayes stepped back, crossing his arms. "You made your choice when you decided that broken-down horse was more important than following orders." Clara gripped the small knife on her belt, her heart hammering as she peered into the darkness beyond her rocky shelter. But then she heard it again. The same soft nicker she'd noticed back at the ranch. Only now it was all around her, coming from every direction. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape for a brief moment, and Clara held her breath. Silhouettes of horses dotted the hillside, standing motionless in the rain like stone statues. When the darkness returned, she convinced herself it had been her imagination, a trick of the shadows and the storm. But then another lightning strike revealed even more shapes, closer now, forming a ragged circle around her hiding place. "What in God's name is this?" she whispered, pressing herself against the cold rock. The horses made no aggressive move toward her. They simply stood there, silent sentinels in the night, their presence both comforting and mysterious. Clara had worked with horses her entire life, but she had never seen anything like this. Wild horses normally avoided humans, especially during storms, when their instincts told them to seek their own shelter. As the rain continued to ease, Clara could make out more detail in the dim, pre-dawn light. These weren't just wild mustangs. She recognized some of them. There was Copper, the old gelding from the Henderson Ranch 5 miles south. Thunder, the black mare from the Miller property, even Duchess, the prized Arabian mare belonging to the rich banker in town. Horses that had never met, from ranches scattered all across the valley, all gathered here in this unlikely place. But what troubled Clara most was how they had gotten here. These animals had escaped corrals, jumped fences, strayed from their usual grazing areas. Some had traveled impossible distances in the middle of a raging storm. It made no sense. It defied everything she knew about equine behavior. She rose slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. The nearest horse, a young chestnut with a white blaze, turned its head in her direction. In its dark eyes, she saw something that made her heart stop. Recognition. Not the recognition of a trained animal for its owner, but something deeper. Something that seemed to say, "We know what you did. We know why you are here." Clara took a hesitant step forward, extending a hand toward the chestnut. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, it stepped closer, allowing her to touch its neck. The animal's coat was warm despite the rain, and she could feel its steady heartbeat beneath her palm. One by one, other horses began to approach, forming a tighter circle around her. She counted them as they emerged from the shadows. 20, 30, 50. More kept appearing from behind rocks and trees, their hooves creating a rhythm like distant drums. Clara had never seen so many horses together outside of a major roundup, and certainly never under circumstances like these. The eastern horizon began to show the first pale signs of dawn, and Clara knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't stay here forever, exposed on the hillside with this strange assembly of animals, but she couldn't bring herself to leave them either. Something about their presence felt important, though she couldn't understand what. As if sensing her uncertainty, the horses began to move, not away from her, but with her, forming loose ranks on either side as she began to walk. Clara found herself at the center of a slow procession, heading back toward the Morrison Ranch. She tried to veer off, to lead them in a different direction, but they gently but firmly guided her path. "Where are you taking me?" she asked aloud, feeling foolish for speaking to animals that couldn't answer. But perhaps they could answer in their own way, because as the sun began to crest the valley, casting long shadows across the pasture, Clara could see their destination clearly. They were heading straight back to the ranch, where she had been humiliated and cast out just hours before, and they were no longer alone. More horses were joining them from every direction, emerging from ravines and meadows, flowing down from the hills like a great tide of living creatures. Clara stopped counting at 100, her mind struggling to process what was happening around her. Whatever this was, whatever force had gathered these animals, it was bigger than anything she had ever witnessed. And somehow, she was at the center of it all. When Clara and her mysterious escort reached the valley floor, the sun had fully risen, painting the pasture in shades of gold and amber. What she saw ahead made her stomach lurch. The Morrison Ranch spread out before them, but something was terribly wrong. Smoke was rising from the stable area, and she could hear men shouting over the sounds of panicked livestock. The horses around her seemed to sense the distress as well. Their ears were pricked. Their nostrils flared as they caught the scents on the morning breeze. The chestnut beside Clara nickered softly, a sound that was somehow both sorrowful and determined. As they drew closer, Clara could see the ranch hands running back and forth between the buildings, their faces tight with worry. The foreman, Hayes, stood in the middle of the chaos, barking orders and waving his arms. Even from a distance, she could see the fury radiating from his stout frame. "The stables are on fire," Clara thought, her heart pounding. She thought immediately of the injured stallion she'd been forced to leave behind. Was he still alive? Could the men even get to him through the smoke and flames? But as they neared the ranch perimeter, Clara realized the smoke wasn't from a fire. It was dust, huge clouds of it, being kicked up by hundreds of hooves. The ranch's own horses had broken loose during the night and were running wild through the property, destroying everything in their path. Fences were trampled, water troughs were overturned, feed was scattered across the ground like confetti. Hayes saw her approaching with the enormous herd behind her, and his face went pale. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken fence post as his eyes took in the impossible scene. 200 horses, maybe more, moving in perfect formation with the woman he had fired just hours before, walking calmly in their midst. "What in the devil is this?" Hayes shouted, his voice trembling with disbelief. Clara felt just as bewildered as he looked. She had no explanation for what was happening, no understanding of why these animals had chosen to follow her swamps to this place. All she knew was that something profound was taking place, something that made her skin tingle with electricity. The horses began to spread out as they entered the ranch, but they didn't scatter randomly as wild animals should. Instead, they formed deliberate lines, creating a corridor that led directly to the damaged stable. Clara found herself walking down this living pathway, feeling both protected and terrified by the power that surrounded her. The ranch hands pressed themselves against buildings and climbed fence posts, staring in awe and fear at the massive gathering. Some whispered prayers, others held their hats to their chests, as if witnessing something sacred. The normal sounds of a working ranch, the clang of metal, the creak of leather, the casual talk of men, had fallen completely silent. Hayes tried to regain control of the situation, shouting orders that no one seemed to hear. His authority, so absolute just a few hours ago, now seemed meaningless in the face of this natural phenomenon. Clara could see the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. As she reached the stable entrance, Clara heard a familiar sound that made her heart leap. The injured stallion was calling to her from inside, his voice weak but unmistakably alive. She looked at the stable door, then back at the sea of horses surrounding her. They were waiting for something. All of them, wild and tame, stood perfectly still, as if holding their collective breath. Clara realized with dawning astonishment that they were waiting for her to act, to make some decision, to determine what would happen next. But before she could move, the sound of approaching hooves echoed from the main road. A single rider was coming at a full gallop, kicking up a plume of dust as he raced toward the ranch. Clara shielded her eyes with her hand and felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the expensive black coat and the silver-trimmed saddle. Morrison himself was returning home, and he was about to witness something that would defy everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Morrison's horse reared as it reached the edge of his property, spooked by the unprecedented sight before it. The rancher fought to control his mount, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and a rising rage as he surveyed the destruction strewn across his land. "Hayes!" Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like the crack of a whip. "What in all that is holy is happening to my ranch?" The foreman, Hayes, stumbled forward, his usual confidence completely shattered. He opened and closed his mouth several times before he could speak, gesturing helplessly at the massive congregation of horses that had somehow materialized overnight. "Sir, the horses, she came back with them," Hayes stammered, pointing an accusing finger at Clara. "The woman I fired last night for insubordination. She's brought some kind of curse on this place. Morrison's eyes found Clara standing in the middle of the equine crowd, and his expression hardened. He had built his fortune by controlling every aspect of his business. Every animal, every employee, every dollar that passed through his hands. What he saw before him represented chaos, the total collapse of the order he had spent years establishing. "You," Morrison said, dismounting and striding toward Clara. "I don't know what kind of trick you're pulling here, but you will call off these animals and get them off my land immediately." Clara felt a surge of anger at his tone, the same dismissive arrogance she had heard from Hayes the night before. These men saw the world only in terms of what could be bought, sold, or controlled. They didn't understand the deeper connections that existed between living things. "This isn't a trick," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And they are not following my orders." "They came on their own," Morrison scoffed, pulling a pair of leather gloves from his belt. "Horses don't behave like this. Animals don't organize into formations and march across the countryside without human guidance. Did you train them somehow? Did you use some method to—" His words were cut short by a sound that brought everyone to a halt. From within the damaged stable came the clear, powerful neigh of the injured stallion Clara had rescued. But this was not the weak call of a suffering animal. It was the proud trumpet of a horse that had rediscovered its strength. The stable door, hanging loose on its hinges from the night's chaos, suddenly swung open. The stallion emerged into the morning light. His injured leg bore his weight without a hint of hesitation. The makeshift bandages Clara had applied were gone, and though she could see the faint outline of where the wound had been, the horse moved with perfect grace. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Animals could heal with remarkable speed, but not like this. Not overnight. Not from an injury that should have left permanent damage. She watched in awe as the stallion approached her, his dark eyes holding the same intelligent recognition she had seen in all the others. The horse gently touched her shoulder with its muzzle, a gesture so tender and deliberate it brought tears to her eyes. Then, he turned to face Morrison and Hayes, his stance proud and defiant. The message was unmistakable. This woman had saved his life, and he had not forgotten. Morrison's face went pale. As a man who dealt in livestock, he knew enough about equine injuries to recognize the impossibility of what he was witnessing. The stallion should have been lame for life, if it had survived at all. Yet here it stood, sound and strong, positioned protectively beside the woman his foreman had cast out. "That's impossible," Morrison whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. But the horses surrounding them seemed to disagree. One by one they began to move closer, forming tighter and tighter circles around Clara and the stallion. Their movements were synchronized, purposeful, a living wall of flesh and spirit that radiated an undeniable power. Hayes stumbled back, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and shame. "Sir, maybe we should call the sheriff, or the army. This isn't natural. It's like something out of the old stories." Morrison ignored his foreman, his businessman's mind racing as he tried to calculate the value of what he was seeing. 200 horses, perhaps more, many of them prime breeding stock from ranches across the territory. If he could somehow claim ownership, assert some legal right over the animals on his property. But before he could speak, Clara stepped forward, her hand resting on the stallion's neck. The simple gesture seemed to send a signal through the entire herd. As one, they turned their attention to Morrison, and in their collective gaze he saw something that made his blood run cold. These were no longer just livestock. They had become something else entirely. Something that recognized no human authority, acknowledged no claim of ownership. And at their center stood a woman who had chosen compassion over orders, who had risked everything to save a single wounded creature. Morrison realized with a growing sense of dread that his next words would determine not just Clara's fate, but the future of his entire operation. Because whatever force had gathered these horses was far more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. And it was waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Morrison stood frozen as the weight of 200 pairs of equine eyes settled on him. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft breathing of the massive herd and the distant sound of wind across the pasture. He had faced down business rivals, weathered financial storms, and commanded respect through sheer force of will. But this was different. This was a test he couldn't buy his way out of. Clara watched the rancher's internal struggle play out across his face. She could see him calculating, assessing, trying to find an angle to restore his control over the situation. But the horses around her remained perfectly still, as if they, too, were waiting to see what he would choose. "I don't understand what's happening here," Morrison said finally, his voice quieter than before. "But I can see these animals are not here by accident." Hayes stepped forward, his voice desperate. "Sir, you can't be seriously considering—" "Quiet, Hayes!" Morrison's command was so sharp, it made his foreman flinch. The rancher's eyes never left Clara's face as he spoke. "Tell me what happened last night. Everything." Clara stood taller, feeling the warm, solid presence of the stallion beside her lending her strength. "Your foreman ordered me to leave an injured horse to die in the storm. When I refused, he fired me and threw me out into the night. These horses, they found me. They followed me and they brought me back here. I don't know why and I don't know how, but I know it means something." Morrison nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the stallion beside her. "And this is the animal Hayes wanted to let die?" "Yes. He said it was worthless, not worth the feed or medicine it would take to heal it." The rancher approached the stallion carefully. His expert eye took in the horse's conformation, the intelligence in its eyes, the obvious strength in its frame. This was no ordinary animal. Even Morrison could see that now. The bloodlines, the natural grace, the almost regal bearing, it all pointed to an animal of exceptional breeding. "Hayes," Morrison called out without turning, "how exactly did you determine this horse was worthless?" The foreman's face reddened. "Sir, it had a leg injury. It looked severe, and the bloodlines aren't documented. No registration papers, no proof of—" "You fool." Morrison's voice was deathly quiet. "This is a descendant of the Spanish war horses. Look at the arch of his neck, the way he carries himself. You nearly made us lose one of the finest animals I have ever seen because you were too lazy to look past a surface wound." Clara felt a spark of hope, but forced herself to remain cautious. Morrison was still a businessman first and foremost, and she had seen how his kind could change their tune when money was involved. Morrison turned back to the assembled herd, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked genuinely humbled by what he was witnessing. "In 30 years of ranching," he said slowly, "I have never seen anything like this. These animals came from dozens of different properties, some from 50 miles away. They traveled through a storm that should have sent them running for shelter, and they are all here because of what you did for one injured horse." The rancher paused, looking out at the sea of horses that had turned his property into something like a natural amphitheater. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone present leaned forward to listen. I have spent my entire life thinking I understood how to manage stock, how to run a profitable operation. But what I am seeing here suggests I have been missing something fundamental about the very nature of these animals. Clara's heart began to race as she realized where his thoughts were heading. But before Morrison could continue, a new sound cut through the moment. The thunder of approaching hooves echoed from the main road. A group of riders was closing in fast, and from their formation and speed, Clara knew they were not bringing good news. The horses around her seemed to sense the approaching threat as well. Their ears pricked up, and she felt a tension spread through the herd like electricity. The peace they had found in this strange assembly was about to be tested by forces beyond anyone's control. The approaching riders emerged from the morning dust like harbingers of trouble. Clara counted at least a dozen men, all armed, their faces grim and determined. At their head rode Sheriff Dunard, his badge glinting in the sun, followed by what looked like ranchers from all over the territory. These were men who had woken up to find their most valuable animals gone, and they had followed the trail to Morrison's land. "Morrison!" Sheriff Dunard called out, as the posse reined in their horses at the edge of the property. "We need to talk. There's been a theft on a scale I've never seen before." The horses around Clara began to shift uneasily, sensing the hostility that radiated from the newcomers. Several of the animals she recognized, including Copa from the Henderson Ranch and Thunder from the Miller Farm, moved closer to her, as if seeking her protection. The irony was not lost on Clara, that the horses were looking to her for safety from their own masters. Morrison stepped forward, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. "Sheriff, I assure you, there's been no theft here. These animals came of their own free will." "Nonsense!" shouted a red-faced man Clara recognized as Henderson. "Horses don't travel 50 miles in a storm to hold a social gathering. Someone orchestrated this, and I want my property back now." Sheriff Dunard's eyes swept over the massive gathering, his expression growing more troubled by the second. "Morrison, I've had reports of missing horses from 17 different ranches. They've all been tracked here. Now, I know you're a respected businessman, but this looks mighty suspicious." Clara felt the situation spiraling toward violence. The mounted men were growing more agitated, their hands drifting toward their guns. The horses around her were reacting to the tension, some beginning to paw nervously at the ground. If shooting started, the chaos would be unimaginable. "Sheriff!" Clara called out, stepping forward despite the risk. "These horses weren't stolen. They came to help." Several of the men laughed derisively at her words. Henderson spat on the ground. "Help? Help with what? And who are you to be speaking for my animals?" Morrison moved to stand protectively near Clara, surprising her with his support. "This woman saved an injured horse last night. Somehow word of that act seems to have spread among the animals in ways we don't understand." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," said Miller, a wiry man with nervous eyes. "Animals don't communicate over distances. They don't organize rescue missions. This woman obviously trained these horses using—" His words were cut off by a sound that silenced every human present. The stallion still standing beside Clara began to call out, not with the simple whinny of a domestic horse, but with something deeper, more complex. Other horses from the herd began to answer, their voices joining his in what could only be described as a song. The sound was unlike anything Clara had ever heard. It started low and mournful, a single voice of grief. Then it swelled in pitch and complexity until it seemed to fill the entire valley. The calls of the horses wove together, creating harmonies that spoke of suffering, loyalty, and hope in ways that transcended human language. Sheriff Dunard's own horse began to tremble beneath him, and Clara saw fear take hold in the lawman's eyes. This was beyond his experience, beyond the simple case of rustling he had expected to solve. The other mounted men were having similar reactions, their own horses growing more agitated as the strange chorus continued. "What in God's name is that?" Henderson whispered, his bravado completely gone. The song reached a crescendo. Then, gradually, it faded, leaving a silence that felt heavy with meaning. In that silence, Clara understood that something profound had just happened. The horses weren't just making noise, they were telling their story, speaking of neglect, abuse, indifference, of the rare human who showed true compassion, and of their choice to honor that compassion in the only way they knew how. Morrison's face had gone ashen during the performance, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "They're not just animals, are they? There's something more." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They always were. We just forgot how to listen." Sheriff Dunard dismounted slowly, his hand far from his gun. The authority he had brought to this confrontation had been stripped away by what he had witnessed. I can't explain what just happened, but I know it wasn't theft." The other ranchers sat on their horses in a stunned silence, staring at the animals they thought they owned, that they thought they understood. Clara could see the gears turning in their minds as they wrestled with implications that challenged everything they believed about the natural world. But the moment of revelation was shattered by a new voice. Hayes, who had been conspicuously silent since the confrontation began, finally broke. "This is all superstitious nonsense," the foreman declared, his voice trembling with a desperate rage. "I will not stand here and listen to grown men act like children afraid of fairy tales. They're livestock, nothing more, and I'm going to prove it." Before anyone could stop him, Race drew his pistol and aimed it directly at the stallion beside Clara. The threat was clear. If these animals were merely property, destroying one would prove his point. If they were something more, then perhaps his bullet would reveal the truth in a way words never could. As one, every horse in the vast herd turned to face Race, their collective gaze holding a silent promise that made the foreman's hand begin to tremble. Clara realized with a surge of terror that the next few seconds would determine not just the stallion's fate, but the future of the relationship between humans and the animals they claimed to control. Time seemed to hang suspended as Race kept the gun trained on the stallion's heart. The foreman's face was flushed with desperation, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool morning air. His finger tightened on the trigger, but something in the unified stare of 200 horses gave him pause. "Race, lower your weapon," Morrison commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "That's enough." "No, sir," Race answered, his own voice trembling. "I will not let a woman and her parlor tricks destroy everything we've built here. They are just animals, and I will prove it." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The stallion did not bolt or rear in panic, as any normal horse would when faced with a gun. Instead, it took a deliberate step forward, placing itself directly between Clara and the weapon. Its dark eyes never left Race's face, and in that gaze was an intelligence so profound, so knowing, that several of the watching men let out an audible gasp. Sheriff Dunard was the first to find his voice. "Race, I'm ordering you to lower that weapon. There's been enough madness here today." The foreman's hand began to shake more violently. The simple act of intimidation he had planned had spiraled into something far more complex. How do you threaten a creature that shows no fear? How do you assert dominance over something that seems to understand exactly what you are doing and chooses to defy you anyway? Clara laid a hand on the stallion's neck, feeling the steady beat of its heart beneath her palm. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, she said softly, her words aimed at Race. They aren't trying to take anything from you. They are just showing you what loyalty is. Morrison stepped forward, positioning himself beside Clara and the stallion. Race, you're fired. Get off my property. The foreman's eyes widened in shock. Sir, you can't. After everything I've done for this ranch, you almost made me lose the finest horse I've ever seen because you couldn't see past your own prejudice, Morrison replied firmly. And now you're threatening to kill him because you can't accept that you were wrong. That's not the kind of man I want running my operation. Race looked around desperately for support, but found none. The other ranchers were staring at their own horses with new eyes, perhaps seeing for the first time the intelligence and loyalty they had always taken for granted. Sheriff Dunar had holstered his weapon completely, his face that of a man whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. Slowly, reluctantly, Race lowered his gun. The defeat in his posture was absolute as he realized that everything he believed about power and control had crumbled in a single morning. Morrison turned to Clara, his expression serious but no longer hostile. I have a proposal for you. I need someone to look after my horses, all of them. Someone who understands them the way you so clearly do. The position comes with a house, a good salary, and full authority over the care of every animal on this ranch. Clara's heart leaped, but she looked at the vast herd that surrounded them. And all the others? They came here for a reason. Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. Any horse that chooses to stay is welcome. Any that wants to go home may go with my blessing. But I suspect many of them were just waiting for someone to treat them like partners, instead of property. As if they understood his words, many of the horses began to move. Some headed towards their respective owners, while others chose to remain. The decisions seemed to be made with careful consideration, and Clara knew she was witnessing something unprecedented. Animals choosing their own destinies based on how they had been treated. Sheriff Dunar mounted his horse, shaking his head in amazement. I came here to arrest horse thieves, and I'm leaving with, well, I don't know what to call this, but it's changed the way I think about every animal I've ever known. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara remained, surrounded by nearly 50 horses that had decided to stay. The stallion that started it all stood beside her, his loyalty absolute. Morrison extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. Welcome to your new life, Clara. Something tells me it's going to be different from anything any of us have ever experienced. That evening, as the sun set over the valley, Clara stood in the doorway of her new home, watching the horses graze peacefully in the pastures. The stallion approached, nuzzling her shoulder gently, in a gesture that had become their greeting. She thought of the night before, when she had lost everything, for choosing compassion over orders. Now she had gained something far more valuable, a partnership with creatures who understood loyalty in a way humans were only just beginning to grasp. The horses had taught everyone present a lesson that would echo through the territory for years to come. True leadership isn't about control or dominion, but about earning trust through kindness, one act of compassion at a time. If you enjoyed this story of loyalty and redemption, consider subscribing to our channel and leave a super chat if this story touched your heart. Your support helps us bring more incredible tales from the American frontier to life. Click the video appearing on your screen now to discover another amazing story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and the natural world.